the 100 Years' War.
Yes,
which wasn't 100 years, but let's not get into that. But it was between England and France, and essentially, it was about the fact that the English kings believed that they had rights to be kings of France, and so they invaded France and they took large portions of France, and then ultimately France sort of fights back. But one of the defining battles of that particular war was Agincourt, and it's one that everybody will know about. It's a famous battle in which the English bowmen are said to have triumphed over the knights of France, which we can discuss shortly. I want to get my fact kind of out of the way, but Henry V. It's this big battle. It's a triumphant battle for England. But my fact is that Henry V couldn't afford to do it, so he actually ended up pawning his crown jewels to investors to go on this particular campaign. Yeah, so that's my fact, is that he had to scrounge his money up. He didn't have nearly enough money to go on the particular campaign, but he was so determined to do it that he pawned his crown jewels.
Wow. Yeah, it's so funny. Within the last 18 months, I watched a movie because I saw a YouTube thing on
that's the most 21st century comment.
Yeah.
Yeah, I watched a movie because I saw a YouTube which I was linked to on a tweet.
Yeah.
that my mom sent me on WhatsApp.
Yeah, it was according to the WatchMojo.com, it was the WatchMojo. It was the top 10 Shakespeare movies, best Shakespeare movies of all time, top 10. And Henry V was one of them. So the Battle of Agincourt is in there.
Yeah.
Doesn't go into the financial status of England.
King, no.
So Crown, I don't know if he would have done that. It's a hell of a fact. I'm going to have to say you're telling the truth, though.
Okay. I mean, I am telling the truth.
Is it?
Yeah, I am telling the truth. It's such a famous battle that there's so many facts connected to it. We know so much stuff about it.
Or was he walking around amongst like a commoner amongst his soldiers, listening to what they were saying about the king? That's in the play.
Oh, right. I don't know whether that's a historical fact, but the night before he made all his men keep quiet because his army was so much smaller than the French's.
Oh.
He didn't want the French to get any idea where exactly he was and what sort of size army he had, because he didn't want to be ambushed before the battle. So they spent the night before the battle allegedly in total silence. The next day they woke up and obviously he'd already lost a third of his men to illness before they even arrived at this particular battlefield. But the tactical genius of it is that essentially the battlefield was like a muddy plain, and it was flanked on both sides by forest.
Yes.
And essentially what he did was he put bowmen in the forests, and then he had guys to kind of standing on the just out of bow range on the far side of the field from the French. And the French were obviously all knights. Most of them, they were heavily armored. A lot of guys came to the battle on horses because at that time, it was seen to be an easy victory for France. They were everybody wanted a piece of the glory. They all wanted to say that they were on the field of Agincourt that slew King Henry. And King Henry himself put himself out front with the units so they could see him in his crown, kind of standing there out front and want him. And the French knights were waiting, and the whole time more and more knights are arriving because they're riding from all over France and they're arriving on the battlefield, and guys are getting a bit brave and they that's fine. Let's just take a call from your mom in the middle of the podcast, Ryan.
Just turn the stupid thing off.
I know it's definitely your mom, right? Like it's.
Sorry, Mom, I can't. It's actually My Way Insurance. I have no idea.
Oh, nice. That's much better.
And I actually cancelled with him.
Can we not
they don't
delete
let
that
me
name?
go.
We don't, because if I was to run a company my way, I wouldn't phone people in the middle of their podcasts and try and. Anyway, so then what happened is the French knights were getting more and more kind of upbeat about this entire process, and they could see this small force on the other side of the field, and some of them started charging. Some of the younger guys, they were like, "Oh no, we're gonna go and get this king," and so they started charging, and then other guys joined in, and they started charging, and because it was between two sort of forests, and it was this thick, muddy field, it had rained the night before. The knights got kind of bogged down in the mud, in the swampy mud, and then they couldn't really move. And then the bowmen came out and fired on them. And while there's some conjecture as to whether a longbow's shaft could actually penetrate plate mail, a lot of people say it couldn't, and the stories of it doing that may not be true. what certainly happened was there was panic, there was horses dying, there was men falling in the mud, and more men coming, and you had almost kind of a football stadium disaster situation where the guys were now compacting, and they were compacting against the infantry at the front end, on the English end, and then they couldn't get back, and the guys were trampling on each other, and then the bowmen were firing, and then the horses are rearing, and it's this terrible scenario. And in fact, English were just kind of hauling guys out through their lines and taking them captive. And they took something like 2,000 people captive, and in the end didn't know what to do with them. And it's one of the horrifying things. They executed a lot of them, which they they kept, I think, the very top guys, but they executed the vast majority, which was not seen to be the way to do it at all. But yeah, it was like a convincing victory. The English lost about 400 people, and the French lost about 6,000. Of which most of the many of those 6,000 were high-ranking nobles and important members of So it was a decisive victory. Wow. And then obviously the fact that people get really kind of excited about was afterwards. These kind of bone pickers went around amongst the men, and apparently guys were dying on that battlefield for a week afterwards. But the bone pickers were going around and knocking out people's teeth, and all the false teeth in England for the next something like 50 years were apparently made out of the teeth of soldiers from Agincourt.
Grief.
But yeah, so that victory, I mean, it's so famous. We know exactly how it worked. We know exactly what happened. And it all started off with King Henry V actually pawning his jewels. He pawned a crown that once belonged to King Richard II, and a very famous kind of gold collar, and a bunch of his jewels. But yeah, that's how it got funded. And then this.
And the player gets offended because they give him a gift of tennis balls or something crazy like that. It's quite crazy.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a nice play because it was produced after toward the end of the Second World War to give the England some morale after the Second World War. The film was produced,
I see.
And of course it's all that once more onto the thing, dear
breach,
dear friends, or block up the passage with the English dead or something like that. It's very, very inspiring.
Yeah. I mean, it's really become that kind of that patriotic English, thing. And I mean, I think they forget that at the ultimate end of the 100-year war, they lost. You know this because they don't have any land in France. So ultimately it was all sort of futile. But they did win Agincourt, and they did.
Are we looking at like 1300s there?
Oh, come now. Are you going to actually ask me dates? I never remember. I'm thinking 1400s. I'm thinking if I'm gonna be honest, I'm thinking it's about Agincourt. Sure, I should know this. It's kind of like
if it's Henry IV. I know Henry VIII was
1500s.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think we're looking at about the early 1400s.
Yes.
Late 1300s.
Yes. Did you 1415 or 14?
1415. Thank you very much, Dietz. We're very
nice
sorry.
One, Dietz.
You can break my finger after the podcast.
Will.
It seems fair. 1415. There you are. So we narrowed it down.
That's one bacon slice from Dietz's ruler for you at the end of.